All right, we're going to get started today. Once again, welcome to WellRight's webinar series for September. September is focused on nutrition. This is our third event. We do have one more next week, same day, same time. So please be sure to attend that one as well. I want to cover housekeeping notes again. Audio. The audio you can listen to over your phone. You can also listen to it from your computer speakers. If you end up having any issues hearing it through the computer, you can switch to the telephone. You do that under your control panel. There's an audio section. Make sure you expand that section, and you can change from mic and speakers to telephone and dial in using the numbers that you see there. Questions can be addressed or sent in at any time, and we'll address them at any time. So please do not wait till the end. Just go ahead and you can type those in. Also in the control panel under the questions section. So just expand that area, and you can go ahead and type that in. And again, we'll take them as they come in. Last thing is we are recording today's event again, so it will be available for playback later today. So once again, we are bringing back Coach Michael, WellRight's own certified health coach, and he also is bringing back another special guest today. So Michael?
All right, everyone, thanks for coming back. We're really, really glad to have you. As you can see on the slide, we're titling it Grains and Legumes, the Yin and the Yang. And last week we did vegetables from a really pretty high level. So today we're going to kind of focus on some popular topics that you're going to see in the news and things that you hear about grains and legumes. And I think it's going to be a pretty interesting journey for everyone. We're bringing back Kristen, my co-host, and she's here with us to give us some insight and just her own perspective and journey along the way, and glad to have her. So thanks for coming back, Kristen.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited about this.
All right, awesome. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So every presentation that we do, we want to give you the big picture. We want to kind of round everything out at first, and then in the end, we like to give you some practical applications. So the big picture here for grains and legumes is, number one, they both assist with longevity, right? So think about it. Anywhere that you've ever traveled or anywhere on the news that you see people that live long, you know, think Japan, think Europe, think South America. Most people don't think America. The big common denominator is they have a lot of fruits, vegetables, and then the two additional things that they all have is beans, legumes, grains. So that's really, really important for their civilization and for their longevity, and they regularly reach over 100. So what I want to make clear is it's not beans and grains specifically that allow them to reach 100, but they're certainly important aspects of their diet. So I really, really wanted to make an emphasis of that. They're really, really healthful foods. Number two, they're whole. Now, with grains in particular, and we're going to go into this a little bit, they suffer from refinement. You know, and you go into a grocery store, most of the grains aren't whole. But when these foods are naturally found and produced and made, they're wonderful because they're whole foods and they're really, really great for the body. And then the third point is, last week we talked about vegetables, and I kind of gave you the green light. And I said, just go. Just eat as many as you can, fill it up on your plate, have some fun. But this week with grains and legumes, I want to encourage a little bit of moderation. They're foods that you can eat every single day, but to illustrate a point, I think we've all either been this person or seen this person where you wake up, you eat cereal, and then you got some grain. And then on the way to work, you have a multigrain bar. And then for lunch, you go to Subway, and then you have bread, grain, sandwich, deli meat. And then for lunch or a snack after lunch, you have another, maybe some Nabisco crackers or some wheat something, so you've got another grain. And then for dinner, well, the American staple is, right, a starch, which is typically a grain, a vegetable, and a meat. So you could have 5, 6 grains all day, and that doesn't even include desserts that you might have that might be made with grain. So we can sort of overdo it. So these are foods that they're really, really good to add to your diet. You just don't need an abundance of them. But you can certainly enjoy them multiple times a day in moderation, so they're really, really great. And let's go ahead and start with just a little bit of foundation. So as we've been working on some content projects here, I started to get into the science of grain a little bit. And I even asked Kristen earlier today, have you seen a picture like this where it actually shows you a grain? And it's sort of the anatomy of a grain. So think of it just like the human body. Like this is the picture on the inside of your grain. And she said, I hadn't really seen it like this. So I thought it would be kind of interesting for everyone else. So it looks like an egg, I guess, if you would. And the way that grains are structured is the bran is sort of the outside layer. It's the protective layer. If you ever hear people say, well, grain's good because of the fiber content. Well, this is what they're specifically talking about. The fibrous material protects the actual seed. So, and that actually brings me to another point. When you think about grain, it's actually the seeds of grass. So it's before the full sprouting, the full maturing of that grass. It's the seed. And so we're either grinding it up or we're making flour out of it, but that's really what a grain is. The inside part, that white part that you're looking at, it's sort of the bulk of the grain. That's called the endosperm, and it's this middle layer that's basically primarily carbohydrate, and it's some protein. And then the third part is the germ. So if you've ever heard of the term sprouted grain, right? This is the embryo. Okay, that's a pretty good example. This is where the seed grows from. So when you hear sprouted, it's the germ that's sprouting the seed and it's becoming mature. And this has a lot of the vitamin E, the B vitamins, the healthy fats. So just to kind of wrap this up neatly, when you hear whole grain, you've got all three of these components in it. There's none of it's missing. It's got your fiber, it's got your vitamin E, your antioxidants, your carbohydrates, and your protein. It all works together as nature meant. Now, when you see a product that's not 100% whole grain, what you're getting is the endosperm. You're getting that middle bulk of carbohydrate and a little bit of protein. And you're missing the minerals, the nutrients, the vitamins, the antioxidants. You're missing the good stuff. I don't know, Kristen, if you've ever gone to the grocery store and you sort of get confused a little bit by whole grain, multigrain. There's so many choices, and I don't think people will ever really look at grain from this perspective with this illustration.
No, and it is confusing. I think when you're at the store and there's dozens upon dozens of loaves of breads to choose from, it can be confusing. And I think just, the main thing is as simple as even a squeeze test. You look at the loaf of bread, and if you squeeze it and it's soft and gushy and gooey, it's probably not the best choice. Those that are a little bit firmer are probably coming from more of a whole pure grain. That's just been kind of my quick little rule of thumb.
I never would have even thought of that. That's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay. So everyone, the squeeze test is pretty good. Just kind of the bulk of the fiber in that bread, like what's the quality, what's the structure of that bread. Tad, our CEO here, he's a great baker on the side, a little bit of a Renaissance man. And he brings in this great bread, and it's really good, and it's whole grain, but I do notice that it has a little bit more structure than that light sort of refined bread that you get at the supermarket. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've noticed that too when he brings it in.
I have.
It's different.
And I've indulged because it tastes delicious. So.
Yeah, same here. So that's a perfect segue into this first myth that I want to go over. And the question is, wheat and multi-grain breads are whole grain. So this really gets to the heart of shopping. So when you go to the store and you're trying to do right for your family, for your kids, for yourself, and you're saying, you know what, we're going to make the decision to not buy white, we're making the decision to buy wheat. And so you see wheat, and there's all these options. There's sprouted, there's wheat, there's multi-grain, and you say, hey, they all look good. I just need to get something wheat, right? It really means nothing. That's a marketing claim. So I want to give you some guidelines here. If it says whole grain, just buy the Grain Council, which helps regulate with the government. If it's 51% whole, real grain that contains all three of those components on the last slide, it can say whole grain. Now, it could be 49% refined grain, right? But as long as they meet that minimum, whole grain, they can say whole grain on it. As long as it's 51% whole grain, non-refined, they can put that print on it. And then the rest of the ingredients are up for grabs. You're not really sure what you're getting. So one thing that I wanted to illustrate for you guys, and Kristen was kind of alluding to shopping and just the field test. Well, this is a look test, all right? So you see on this bread where it says 100% whole grain, not every company can put this on their product, actually. There's a regulation for this. And if it's 100% whole grain, meaning all of the constituents of this product are whole, they can put 100%. But they cannot put 100 if it's not. So when you go to look for bread, when you go to look for grain, think oats, think rice, look for 100% because that's a privilege for the company to be able to see that. Now, Kristen, you told me earlier you buy sprouted bread. Do you remember if on yours it has 100%?
It does.
It does?
It does.
Okay, so Kristen pointed out something kind of interesting earlier. She was like, well, what about sprouted? Well, it's a good question. With sprouted grain, if you remember back to that slide, and we can just shoot back real quick, that germ, that little orange part right there, it's allowing that germ to grow, right? And so there's some claims about it that say, well, you get a little bit less carbohydrate, a little bit more protein, it has to be whole. So maybe there are some benefits to it. Ezekiel bread, a pretty popular one. Kristen seems to think it's 100%, yeah. So yeah. That's probably a pretty good one. All right, well, let's go on to our next one. This one's kind of fun. So grains cause weight gain. And I'm going to tell you, I'm just being honest here, I fell for this for like 5 years. Okay, I went like grain-free, carbohydrate-free. I was not like an Atkins guy, but I certainly was scared of carbohydrates. They kept me up at night. I didn't want any. Because I thought they all led to weight gain. This just simply isn't the case. And I could give you all these facts about physiology and biology of why that's just not the case, but I just want to show you something different. So there's this researcher, Stephen Guyonnet, out of the University of Washington, got his PhD in obesity. So this is one of the world's leading experts on obesity and the causes of it. Like, why do we gain weight, right? And when he was going through all of this data, the one thing he showed, and I thought this was so interesting, I want you to focus on the green line first. The green line's protein. From 1900 to year 2000, it's virtually been unchanged. We generally eat about the same amount of protein. Now let's move up to the blue line. This is fat. So 1900, we ate, give or take, about 700 calories a day. 2000, we're up to about 1,000 calories a day. So we know that fat's been steadily increasing a little bit. But this line is what's interesting. I want you to look at the red line. Back in 1900, we were getting 1,500 calories a day of whole grain, carbohydrate, right? Now, it dipped into the 50s when they were kind of changing the way products were made. And then when we started to get into the obesity crisis, which was kind of around the 80s, the carbohydrates started increasing again. Now, you would say, well, Michael, that kind of ruins your point, right? I mean, if the carbohydrates are increasing and the obesity is increasing, then it has to be carbohydrates. Well, that's the popular researcher method. That's how they verify that carbs are bad. But here's what I want you to look at. Back in 1900, fat was really low and carbs were really high. So they kind of met in the middle, and it was a pretty good portion size. And even though the carbohydrates were really, really high, people weren't fat. Actually, obesity was really, really low back then. But what ended up happening around 1980, 1990, 2000 is the fat kept going, so you got calories from fat, and then the carbohydrates started going too. So now you had like a double whammy. And so just in general, people's calories were way higher. And so I just want to show you that there's been times in civilizations where carbohydrates have almost accounted for 80% of all the calories, and no one was obese. No one was gaining weight. Carbohydrates are not evil. They're actually great. And they fit really great in a diet that just is lower in calories, that's moderated. And you get to choose. You want a little bit higher fat, a little bit higher protein, a little bit higher carbohydrate, it's fine. It doesn't really matter. And Kristen, I don't know if you've experienced that, like kind of playing around with your carbs and your fat and your protein because you're an endurance athlete. So have you noticed a difference when you take carbs way down?
I do. and the source of the carbs that I'm taking. My energy levels, especially the longer, I'm a runner, and so the longer the distances that I'm running, if I'm not fueling myself with the purest form of carbohydrate, my fatigue level increases. So that's where some of like the sprouted grain, whole grain comes into play, where I do notice a performance spike there, where I can perform longer. Wheat is one that I'm still on the fence about.
Okay.
And I think it's maybe some of my own misconceptions or ideas behind how I feel when I eat wheat. And even more recently, in the last week, I've been consuming more whole wheat. And I'm feeling some inflammation, I think, as a result of it, some fatigue as a result of it. I'm going to really put it to the test, though, this weekend.
Okay.
Because I want real impact of what I'm eating to be demonstrated throughout my long run on Saturday.
Well, that's interesting what you say, too. And for everyone on the call, it's really important to think about how food affects your body. You know, so Chris was pointing out here with wheat, maybe for her, maybe it could be the specific brand or what she's eating, but she's starting to notice an actual change in her body over time. You know, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. So it's really important to be in tune with that, because our bodies are all different, and we all react a little bit differently to food. Well, we're going to go back to that, because I want to brush that off. So in a few slides, we're going to be able to revisit that. Beans contain dangerous proteins and should be avoided. So this is really specific, but this is a big movement right now. There's the paleo movement. There's the sort of these agricultural movements of organic and GMO-free. There's these ancestral movements where people are saying that maybe beans aren't so healthy. And what this really stems from is beans contain a protein called lectins. And lectins protect the bean as a plant from predators. So in nature, animals don't like beans very much because they have a hard time digesting them, because these little proteins, call them like plant warriors. They make it really difficult on the animals. And that's where a lot of it stems from. They say, well, if plants use these to protect themselves and they hurt animals, well, then they must be bad, right? And that's really, really nearsighted. So it's a myth. And let's talk about this. So these proteins, actually, there's a couple interesting things it does in the human body. In small doses, it actually helps what's called cell-to-cell adherence. And what that really means is it allows cells to connect to each other, to work really, really well, without actually forcing the immune system to kick in. So that's a really big point. So the immune system, when you're activating it in large doses, it takes a lot of resources in the human body. So these lectins actually have some positive things that it does in the body. The other thing is in nature, you know, a raw bean, let's say kidney beans. If you've ever heard I don't know if you've ever heard this, but like you can't eat kidney beans raw, right? They're really dangerous for humans. Well, the lectin's like 70,000 units. When you cook those kidney beans, it's 200 units. It's not even in the neighborhood. Like, it's so small, it's just irrelevant. On top of that, ancestrally, we know that we have been consuming beans for 10 to 15,000 years. So we know that it's been in human diets for a really, really, really long time. And then last, I suppose maybe a little bit of the nail in the coffin, these same proteins are found in dairy, these lectins. They're found in vegetables. So you can find them in other food, not just beans. It's kind of one of those things where in America, like our food movements, we like to demonize something. We have to like look at something and say, well, this has something bad in it, therefore this has to be bad. And I don't know, you worked in a lot of gyms, you worked around a lot of fitness professionals, like you've probably seen it in the media, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, do you have an opinion on it? Do you feel like it's been a little overblown a little bit?
I feel it's been a little overblown. Yeah. I think things get fatty and trendy. You know, paleo is one of them that I think tries to put the kibosh on the bean and the legume, and then there's the super grain, which is quinoa, which has made a huge kind of play in the whole fitness world as far as that being a more favorable choice from a grain standpoint.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm glad that I'm sitting in on this, because that's one of the topics for me that I know is a little gray.
Well, my buddy Jackie's in the call too, and she kind of does a little bit of a paleo too, and we've kind of talked about this. And so I am very pro-paleo. I don't specifically do paleo diet myself. I eat very much like them, I would say. And there's a lot of people that are anti-paleo. Here's the deal, though. It's actually, they eat a ton of fruits, a ton of vegetables. Most of it's organic. I mean, that's a huge part of the movement. Most of it's from natural whole sources. There's zero refinement. They do eat some protein, and people think, well, all they eat is protein all day. That's not even close. They eat mostly vegetables and fruits all day, and they just happen to have clean sources of protein. So it's just my one disagreement with it. It's just on the beans section, and they're actually coming to the forefront. Jackie was telling me the other day they're starting to reconsider some of these foods a little bit.
Well, they've reconsidered potatoes.
Reconsider potatoes.
That's,
Cool.
that's in. But yeah, the beans, not so much yet.
Not so much yet. Okay,
yeah.
so we've got a little maybe road to go across if we ever do, but you know, we can differ there. But overall, I mean, it's a pretty good diet. I think this is our last true or false. Beans and grains should be eaten at the same meal for my complete protein. All right, this is for my vegetarian, vegan friends out there. So if you've ever heard of vegetarian combining, basically what it means is this. There's only a handful of vegetable proteins that are complete, where you could actually just eat these proteins. And I'll just give you a few examples, like hemp protein's one of them, soybean proteins are another one, green sea algae is another one, buckwheat, I believe, is one as well. Like, these are full, real proteins. But most of the other plants, specifically grains and nuts and beans, most of them aren't complete. They're missing one protein or the other. So when you combine them together, they form one beautiful protein. And the most popular one is grains and beans. They're really, really great because the proteins that each of them are missing, the other has. So it's like brother and sister. It's perfect. They just join together. And so there's been this thing in the vegetarian and vegan community that you have to have these two in the same meal every time if you want to get a complete protein. I remember I used to train with a vegetarian bodybuilder, and he was so adamant. He would say, no, I have to have grains and legumes or nuts and legumes, and he lived this way for a long time. But there's been some great research, actually, that's come out, and they actually show you that, you know what, the body's really smart. It has this protein pool, if you would, and it puts all these proteins in a pool within a 24-hour period, and it can just pull what it wants. So you can eat beans in the morning, grains in the evening, so we're going to bust that myth. That is not true. Just eat lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, good sources of protein, mix them up, but as long as you have grains and legumes or legumes and nuts within the same day, you're golden. All right, so nutrition spotlight. We did one last week. We're going to do one. Popular media. Gluten. Is it really the devil's own food? I saw that not too long ago, and I'm like, you know what? I see a new gluten article every day, and then in the store, I see gluten pretty much every time I go there now. I was at my in-laws last week, and my father-in-law goes to give my son Chex, right, corn cereal. And he looks at me, and I'm like, I think that might be a little processed. And he goes, no, it's gluten-free. Look at the box. So everyone's putting gluten on their product claims now because it's like the new health claim. But does everyone need it? Well, if you look, I put an abstract on the side of it, a little piece of research. And basically, this just took tons of research studies, tons of people, and it's like, who actually needs to stay away from gluten? Well, there's two types of people, right? There's celiacs, which they literally have an aversion to gluten, like their body can't handle it. And then there's gluten sensitivity, so people who are a little bit more sensitive. Now, according to research right now, and this is the best that we have, 0.5% of the population are celiacs. So like 0.5 people out of 100. So it's not a lot of people. And the gluten-sensitive people, I read an article this morning, a research paper, that they're thinking it's even less than celiacs. So this combined, gluten-sensitive people and celiacs are like less than 1%. So 99% of people may not need to worry about gluten. But I don't want to say that it's irrelevant, because for people who are sensitive to it or have an aversion to it or they have stomach aches from it, they really do feel it. So going back to Kristen, what you said earlier, your sort of experience with the wheat, you may be that 1%. You may be part of that group where your diet's very clean and you feel good all the time. And then you add something like a wheat in there, maybe the gluten does really upset you. And so, like, I don't think I want to dampen that for people because, you know, there are a lot of people who buy it for the health claim. But then there's a whole set of other people who really do need gluten-free foods. So, and you said you're maybe starting to feel a little bit better not having it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just even recently, just incorporating more gluten, I guess if you want to call it that. The side effects that I recognize, and maybe it is because I typically eat very clean, would be the inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
And fatigue slightly. This is a little on the gross side, so I apologize, but a little more mucousy than normal. So like when I'm running, I may have a little more phlegm than I would normally.
Yeah.
So again, I think it's just, I know my body and how I feel, and it's kind of a process of elimination on just keeping a food diary and how am I feeling myself, and when I notice these changes, trying to make the connection with maybe what is having that impact. So right now, I love wheat, but I'm looking at the way I'm eating my wheat and is it making an impact or not. So.
And that's totally relevant to your own diet, right? Like what's weird for me is avocados, for some reason, they make me feel not so hot. And I love them, and I could eat them literally every single day for every meal. But and they're vegetable, and they're wonderful. They're like a superfood.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't all the time, right? So you just kind of listen to your body. You just know it. Well, last but not least, I wanted to give you just 2 points today, just to leave with, to take home. So let's get back to the bread. Replace the pantry with grains that are 100% whole grain. And maybe I shouldn't just say bread. This goes for your oats, your rice, all of your grains, quinoa, millet, buckwheat, you name it. Whatever you buy, look for 100%. You can't go wrong. Just 100% whole grain, and you're going to buy the highest quality grain you can get. So that's a really, really easy way to just improve the nutritional content of what you're consuming. And then last, get some beans in your life. You know, go to the store, buy beans. It doesn't have to be the one that you saw on CNN that's best for heart disease. Go buy the ones you like. I love black beans. My wife loves kidney beans, so we mix it up. But get some beans, buy them at the store, come home and just use them for dishes that you wouldn't normally. Throw them in salads. They're wonderful. If you're having a protein, put them next to your protein. Replace them with potato every now and again. You know, they're so versatile. They're so flexible. You can season them. They're really, really good. So my challenge to you guys is buy 100% whole grain and then add some beans in, and I think you're going to be doing pretty good. And I guess it's a little bit of my closing remarks as well. You know, that's kind of how that's I think 2 really, really good tips. And I don't know, Kristen, if you had any closing remarks on the presentation.
I think just, you know, overall, the closer to the natural state of the food we're consuming, and yeah, maybe it's a little more inconvenient, I think the better off we're all going to be. Our families are going to be happier, we're going to be happier. And I think just physically we're going to feel better when we're eating foods that are in more of a pure state. Granted, there's going to be a breakdown in process of preparation, but if we're preparing it ourselves at home versus opening a box and pouring it in a pan, I think it's just the right choice. It can't always happen, but I think, you know, everything in moderation.
Well, one day we'll do a presentation again on the actual time it takes to prepare whole food versus leaving your house, putting your coat on, getting your keys, getting your kids in the car, going to McDonald's, turning back around, fighting traffic, locking your car, opening the bag. You're probably not saving that much time, but that's for another day.
Right.
So I guess we'll open the floor to some questions.
All right, great. As a reminder, we're taking questions through the web meeting. You can type those in the questions section of the control panel. Just be sure you expand that section by hitting that triangle next to questions. You can go ahead and type those in. I do have 2 I want to start with. One is about, like, what if your goals are weight loss?
Yeah.
And that's one of your major goals. How do the grains play into that? Because I've always heard, you know, limit bread if you're trying to lose weight. And you're saying whole grain bread is okay.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, it's good for you.
Absolutely.
Is there a concern if you have weight loss goals?
You know what? I think what ends up happening for people with grain and bread is that it sort of becomes like a food boat, right? It's like they put it with everything. So it's like, I think I'll have a little meat with my bread. And I think I'll have, you know, I think I'll use the bread as a side for my dish that I already have a bunch of starch in it anyway. Like, I've got potatoes and I need a little bit of bread as a side. I think when it comes to weight loss, and you look at metabolic studies, They're called metabolic ward studies. And basically they invite a bunch of people into a laboratory. They don't let them leave. They say, kiss your kids goodbye and we're locking you up for 2 weeks. And they measure out every gram of food. And they measure out every gram of protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And they always use whole grains. And the one thing we find is that even when one group does some high carbs and one group does low carbs and one group does high protein and one group does low protein, at the end of the day, they all end up losing the same amount of weight. I battled with these studies for 9 years. I'm so serious when I say this. I wanted to believe carbohydrates were bad. Like, I really wanted to believe it. But since I've added back carbohydrates into my diet and I've just watched how much I eat in total, because that's really the missing link. Like, how much are we actually eating in total? When I reined that in a little bit, I added carbs back in. I was leaner than I've ever been in my entire life. I had no problem maintaining elite levels of body fat. So I would say, if you want to add the carbs in, but you're a carbaholic, like you tend to favor carbs for everything, then maybe it's not so much the carbs being bad, but how much you're eating. So that's the one thing I think about.
Okay, great. Question about bean intake. How do you control flatulence with increased bean intake?
I fear that question.
Very common. Very common.
It is, and it's true. Beans have a specific fiber that impacts the gut a little bit differently, and it creates gas as a byproduct of the fermentation. So Beano is so pretty popular. We've seen it, I don't know, that since I was a kid, in the 80s. Like, Beano's been all over. Maybe not so much anymore, but that's a really, really great inhibitor of this specific fiber that causes flatulence. The other thing is soaking. If you soak your beans, maybe overnight, it actually breaks down a lot of this material that can create intestinal issues. So if you're not used to soaking, like, that's totally cool, because I just started doing it 2 years ago. I was never a soaker as well. So, just get yourself some water and soak your beans overnight, and you can really cut down on it quite a bit. So that's maybe two pretty good tips.
Okay. All right. And one more question about bread.
Bread, okay.
And buying it.
Okay.
Advice on buying it, because I feel like there's so many options. I think Christy, you mentioned it's crazy in the store, especially one that you find I found one that's 100% whole wheat,
yeah.
But yet there's some sugar in there, that is a little high. Like, is there any advice, guidelines in buying bread?
Yeah, Jackie, that's like a good comment, because a few weeks back I was going to my grocery store and I always get the same bread, but I realized, I'm like, well, I know what bread to buy, but what about everybody else, right? So I went to the bread aisle, which is like as long as any aisle in the store, and I started at the beginning of the aisle, and I just started looking for 100%. That was my only criteria. I was checking it off. I found 2 out of 40, right? So for many stores, it's a little disheartening, but they almost always have 1 or 2 brands that are 100%, and let those be your go-to brands, right? If they have it, pick it up. That's the good stuff. And just recognize the brand, right? And so when you go shopping, you just know what to look for. So that's one of the things. And then you also mentioned sugar. Mm-hmm. Bread shouldn't have incredible amounts of sugar, but sometimes even like a natural bread, they will use a little bit of sugar to add in moisture. They'll use honey. They'll use different forms of sugar, even fibrous sugars, to add in some moisture back into the bread. But if you're getting over 10 grams of sugar in your bread, you've got an issue. But if you're sitting between 3 and 6 grams a slice, you're probably in pretty good shape. I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
All right, that's it for the questions. I think we're going to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for attending today. As I mentioned, this will be available for playback later. And be sure to attend next week for our last event of September. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.